Hey geeks! The face of North Korean TV is a woman named Ri Chun-hee, and she's this bombastic news anchor who was just gifted a luxury 2-bedroom apartment along a river in Pyongyang because of her loyalty to Kim Jong-un. It's kind of an interesting gift when half the country is starving. I figured if she could get this apartment, then I can get one too, so I'm submitting an audition tape to be the next face of North Korean TV. Hello, comrades! Welcome to Kim Jong-un's show. I mean my show. We have successfully launched a hydrogen missile. And the enemy should shudder and cower in fear. Our great leader, the supreme leader, he's born from God. He's born without an asshole. I can't take credit for that joke. It came from that movie, The Interview. If you starve, know that it is for your country. If you are watching this from a labor camp, know that you sacrifice for our dear leader. Good? Too much? We got a lot to talk about. We have the latest in Ukraine, violence in Israel, Shanghai's lockdown, some bad behavior from a spyware company, and how you can help flood victims in South Africa. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button below, click the notification bell, and like this video. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has been pummeling Mariupol, which is a port city in the southeast of the country. Mariupol is strategically important because it's right next to Russia, it's on the water, and most importantly, it's in between Crimea, which Russia controls, and the Donbas area under Russian rebel control. So if Russia can get Mariupol, they create one connected section on the eastern side of Ukraine, which will allow them to easily move and station troops and equipment. Even with Russia's brutal assault on the city, the Ukrainians have refused to surrender. Right now, troops and civilians are holed up at a steel plant in Mariupol in what's basically the last pocket of resistance, and so the city might fall to the Russian government in a matter of days or even hours, which could give Russia the celebration it's looking for in the run-up to its Victory Day on May 9th, which is an annual holiday when Russia celebrates the Soviet defeat of the Nazis. Gaining control over Mariupol would also give Russia a symbolic win after some pretty embarrassing losses they've had. They weren't able to take control over Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and Ukraine just sank their huge navy vessel called the Moskva. So now Putin is trying desperately to portray strength. This week, for example, Russia test-launched a new nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile called the Sarmat, which we call the Satan II. The test wasn't a surprise to the US, and the Pentagon says it's not a threat. I think Putin was literally flexing his muscles in front of a mirror during that launch. President Zelensky said Ukraine will not give up land in the east, and international governments continue to try and support Ukraine's military. The US is sending an additional $800 million in military aid, and the UK is also sending armored vehicles and anti-ship missile systems. Germany just announced it'll stop importing Russian oil entirely by the end of the year, and that's huge. Even Wimbledon announced Russian and Belarusian tennis players won't be allowed to play in this year's tournament. The US government said we should expect the war to last through the end of the year, and I gotta tell ya, wars either end quickly or they linger for way longer than a year, which is why I would say governments need to get that option out of their heads and put themselves in the mindset of ending this as quickly as possible. Violence in Jerusalem broke out last week on a day where you had some major holidays all at once. It was Passover, Ramadan, Good Friday, and Tax Day. And the issue with these holidays in Israel is that they tend to create tension when thousands of people go out to neighboring locations to worship. Now, when you discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people hate what you say before you even open your mouth. So every time I say something that is mildly controversial, you all have the freedom to throw a tomato at my face. Let's start with the facts and timeline of what happened. We didn't even start yet. On Friday, April 15, Palestinians headed to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is at the top of a hill also known to Jews as Temple Mount, which is a holy site for both Muslims and Jews. Okay, good. No tomato there. Palestinians arrived early that morning for dawn prayers at the mosque on the second Friday of Ramadan, and some of them began throwing stones and fireworks at the Israeli police. The police were keeping guard at a gate that leads to the Western Wall, which is a major Jewish holy site. Both are literally right next to each other. So then the Israeli police entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque in force, which they rarely do and is seen as an escalation. From there you had clashes. Inside the mosque compound, where Israeli police fired sound grenades and rubber bullets and arrested more than 400 people. A total of 152 Palestinians and 3 Israeli police were injured. Things calmed down at the mosque, but tensions are still high. You've had clashes here and there around the mosque this week, and Israel has shot down rockets fired from the Gaza Strip, which they've responded to by striking Hamas militant sites in Gaza. It's okay, it's not like this could get out of control or anything. Okay, so now you have the lay of the land. What's the deal? The bottom line is that if each side had its own state, and each government was policing its own people properly, then you probably wouldn't have this problem every year. Now, I should mention that Israeli nerves may have also been high following a recent spate of terrorist attacks committed by Arab citizens in Israel, which prompted the Israeli military to intensify its raids in the West Bank. The bottom line is there are no winners on either side of this. But there are some real signs that things could get out of control despite efforts to not let it get there. For the first time, though, I actually have hope for an end to this mess, because the Arab states that have normalized ties with Israel through the Abraham Accords have a real opportunity to push for the creation of a Palestinian state. And that would bring an end to this conflict that has lasted over 7 decades. I wasn't going to cover the lockdown in Shanghai, but it's become so bat crazy that we can't not talk about it. China got hit with a massive wave of Omicron in March, and because they pursue what they call a zero COVID policy, they locked down certain cities, including Shanghai, which is the world's most populous city with over 25 million residents. China said they did this to prevent their large elderly population from getting the virus, which could overrun China's healthcare system. So people were told in early April that they were just going to test everyone and lock down for a few days, pluck out those who tested positive, and then reopen. So people figured, okay, no problem, and they didn't stock up on groceries or other essentials. Except nearly 4 weeks later, the lockdown looks more like a picture of a repressive dictatorship exercising cruel and dumb policies rather than a measure to protect people. The Chinese regime started testing people, and if you test positive, you're whisked away to a quarantine facility, which are often convention centers where thousands of people sleep in the same large room and there are no showers or running tap water. Kids who test positive have been taken away from their parents. And for people who've had pets left behind, the government has either killed the pets or left them to die. For those who test negative, they can stay in their apartment, but they can't go outside except to get tested. And now many are literally starving. They have to rely on government food handouts, of which there are very little, or on expensive food deliveries, which are nearly impossible to get. People have tried to protest, even just by screaming from their windows, but the government has just sent drones and robots telling them to shut up and stay inside. This lockdown will also have global economic consequences, given that 20% of the world's shipping goes through Shanghai, and all of that is now stuck. That affects global supply chains, which affects inflation everywhere. It's not up to me to police a government's lockdown, especially since I come from a place where apparently herd immunity is the policy. But when people are literally dying or starving from a policy that's allegedly supposed to protect them, then it's something we have to call out as wrong. Ronan Farrow published a bombshell story in The New Yorker this week about the Israeli company NSO Group and its spyware called Pegasus. This spyware can access texts, photos, videos, documents, and download them. So the next time you're sitting on the john scrolling on TikTok, just remember there may be someone literally watching you through your phone's camera. Now, NSO says it only sells its spyware to military, law enforcement, and intel agencies from countries with good human rights records. Except that's just not true. It's sold to both democratic and repressive governments who use the software to spy on journalists, activists, and dissidents. So for example, the phones of Catalan officials and individuals campaigning for independence from Spain were hacked using Pegasus. One organization says the UAE and possibly other countries like India, Cyprus, and Jordan hacked British government officials. Germany, Poland, and Hungary have used this software, and Saudi Arabia used it to help carry out its murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Interestingly, Ukraine wasn't able to get this spyware because NSO Group feared that giving them this technology would upset Russia. Good to know whose side you're on. The US government doesn't like Pegasus or any private spyware in general because it's totally unregulated, which means it's vulnerable to this kind of abuse. It also allows repressive governments to further carry out their repression. It undermines democracy by intimidating journalists, activists, and dissidents, and it has real scary consequences. Pegasus, for example, has been connected to 300 acts of physical violence so far. Now, spyware can also have positive sides to it, because it can help law enforcement find real criminals. So I don't want to pretend like this technology can't be used for good, but it should never be used for bad. And frankly, that's not that hard. It should be easy for NSO Group to choose clients carefully and place conditions on how the spyware is used. But it seems to have made a deliberate choice to favor profit over people's lives. And for that reason, NSO Group is on my shit list this week. South Africa was hit by one of the worst natural disasters it has ever recorded when storms in an area called Durban killed almost 450 people. This storm caused massive destruction, and the reason you had this many deaths is because many people had been moved to this flood zone over 10 years ago when the South African government was building its stadiums for the World Cup Games. They were promised permanent housing later, but never got it, and South Africa's president actually admitted this major shortfall and pledged to fix it. But in the meantime, there are people urgently in need of help. So if you're interested in making a donation, there are a few organizations doing some amazing work to help flood victims there, and my new researcher Eliana narrowed them down and vetted them for you. The first is Gift of the Givers, which is a South African-based disaster relief organization, and Africa Outreach Project, which is actually Charlize Theron's charity, which is working to support flood victims right now. Thanks for watching, geeks. Thanks for sticking with me too, because it was mostly bad news this week. I won't be here next week, but I'll make sure to catch you up when I'm back. In the meantime, please like this video, click the subscribe button and the notification bell, and if you have something you want me to talk about, reach out to me over social media and I will give you a shout out. Stay fabulous, geeks.